Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. And as you can see, we're in the usual loose decadent mode of just lounging around in the living room with a few books. And I want to talk about a new favourite author. Of course, when I say favourite, I mean flavour of the month at the moment. Because, of course, to become one of Steve's very favourite authors takes some time, a lot of dedication, a lot of writing. And, you know, you've got to combat the people who've already done the last word, which is hard stuff. So I'm going to talk about three writers today, one in particular. One I've talked about before and we'll talk about again soon, or I may have already done a video about him, we'll see, because I'm doing a lot of off-the-cuff these things these days to give you this sort of feel of the bookish life, as they say. So it is going to be a few writers, and I'm starting with this new writer I've just discovered, who has absolutely blown me away. And believe you me, this doesn't happen very often. And I just think this guy's great, and I think you should run out there and buy his books. And what he does a combination of, how can we put it? He writes fiction. Technically, you would say they're general fiction. However, some of them are definitely weird fiction with supernatural elements, folk horror, and it's more about the way he structures things and his prose, which is very understated but very telling. And he's just really got me, and I'm just going to sort of burble about him really, because I think he's really good. And this is his first book. His name's Gary Budden, as you can see, and this is Hollow Shores, and it's from Dead Ink. And Gary has his own press, which he started, called Influx Press, which has done lots of really good work. And Dead Ink is a small press. And this is a collection of short stories which came out in 2017. And Gary's in lots of anthologies. And this is really brilliant. And as I say, this is his first book. But I actually read his second book, London Incognita, which is from 2020 first. And this actually turned up where I work as a freebie 4 years back. I had a look at it and I thought, do I really want to go there? Am I fed up with the London thing? You know, I've read lots of London stuff, Ian Sinclair, Peter Ackroyd, Michael Moorcock, M. John Harrison, all sorts of things. Is it kind of done? And then the book disappeared, but then it miraculously reappeared the other day. And I picked it up on my lunch break and started reading it. And I have to say, it really put a hook in me. So I'm going to talk about both of these. They are linked. And Hollow Shores is a collection of short stories. And the thing is, it's more like a mosaic novel in a way, because a lot of the characters come back and forth. And it's narrated in a number of voices, a number of first-person narrators. And it begins with a fairly conventional folk horror story called Breakdown. It begins with this folk horror story, which is a fairly conventional ending, but it's very, very well done. And you think, oh, well, okay. But what you discover is that spreads out like roots from a tree into the soil of this book, and connections are made all the time. And the characters have a relationship to a place called Hollow Shores, and it's all set around London, southeast coast. There's a lot about punk rock in it, not the sort of punk rock which I associate with, which is the early stuff, 76, 77, 78. This is slightly later, the Crass era and beyond. And there are a number of characters, and we see them, and they're vaguely countercultural. They come from that part of London. They go to gigs a lot. They spend a lot of time at this place, Hollow Shores. There's a lot of psychogeography. There's a lot of good landscape in it. The stories are more like vignettes than tales, and you don't always know whose voice it is to begin with, but you start to see this web-like relationship between these characters. And what I found was that for me, I was familiar with some of them already because they come up in the novel London Incognita, which I'd already read when I started reading this. And the initial story does have connections to others, and it's absolutely fantastic. The thing I find with most collections is they have too many stories in them. However, this has a total of 22 stories, some of which appeared in magazines, and they have titles like Salt Marsh, Baleen, which of course is like a whale's teeth, Bent Branches, The Hollow Shore, Mission Drift, Spearbird. There's things also in here about bird watching and wildlife, and it's really good. So it's an amazing mixture of weird fiction, folk horror, mainstream contemporary fiction with psychogeography, urban studies, and it might sound daunting, but it's really, really readable. And every now and again, the characters will just come out with like a statement or a question, which is quite bold and unadorned, but really cuts to the heart of things. And I thought it was fantastic. But as I say, I read that after reading Gary's novel, London Incognita. And when I first started reading this, I wasn't sure if it was a novel. Again, it felt like a short story collection. So it's really a mosaic novel, and you don't really worry about chronology too much and about what happens in terms of cause and effect. And it's fundamentally about two brothers. And we see them in London in the early 70s. And they sort of become separated. And one of them sort of goes missing, but the other one keeps seeing his sibling passing by on a bus or getting onto a tube as he's getting off, things like that. And they're both obsessed with a mystical figure called the Judder Man. And some of these stories were assembled into a book called The Judder Man, which was shortlisted for the Shirley Jackson Award. So it is sort of spiritual horror, it is fantasy. But there's an awful lot about the city in this. There's also things about punk and about sort of other forms of rock music again. And what happens is as time goes on, other voices come in. Again, it's narrated by different voices. And years and years later, when we get into the 21st century, there's a female voice who is the niece of the two brothers who she's never met, and she becomes obsessed with them, and she starts writing this punk fanzine in the late 90s, and it becomes quite a cult thing, and she becomes like a major name in underground press, and we see her becoming artistically successful, and she is wondering about her missing uncles and what happened to them. And there's an awful lot in this about being part of the counterculture and aging, about the gentrification of places in London, how they were once cutting edge and now they're very safe sort of spaces. And it's wonderful because you don't often get people in the counterculture who think they're countercultural speaking about aging and being realistic about it. And this happens in these narratives. And these two books put together, I think, make an absolutely wonderful diptych, and they're really, really great. So if you like people like M. John Harrison, Joel Lane, Ian Sinclair, the thing with Gary's writing is it's more straightforward than all these people. I actually think this guy's better than Joel Lane. He isn't so fixated on horror as such. I think he's broader. I think he says more. And, you know, the way that the interrelations in the characters, they just come up like a web and things keep popping up and you get the real fullness and wonder of that part of England and London. And I really can't recommend them enough. I really think you should read them. And the books I found the most exciting this year. And they are far more accessible than people like, say, M. John Harrison. They're very, very readable, and they have all these facets. And I know I'm just waffling, really. They're really fantastic. He has a real facility, and I think you should read his work. He is kind of associated with a lot of other writers in the UK. The small press scene is quite interesting because there are a lot of people working on the fringes of horror, folk horror, psychogeography, nature writing, SF, fantasy. And their work is popping up in all sorts of weird little anthologies and chapbooks and things. And it's a very sort of vital area. And you see a lot of anthologies pop up. And this is an anthology which I bought recently, edited by Dan Coxon. And it's called Out of the Darkness, as you see. And it's published by Unsung. Unsung are another interesting small press, do all sorts of great stuff. And I have read several SF novels they published. And it's in association with a charity called Together for Mental Wellbeing. And I know everybody goes on about mental health these days, but this is an anthology to support that. And it was put together, it was coming together just before the pandemic, and then it came out in 2020. And a lot of the stories in it, I must admit, I wasn't that fussed on. However, there's a Gary Budden story in here which I liked. There's a Elijah Whiteley story. There's also, let's see what else made an impact, Alison Moore, who I quite like. I wouldn't say I'd read a whole collection by her. I did have a collection by her, which was published by Salt, but I passed it on even though it was a nice little book. And there's a great story in here by Gareth E. Rees. Now, Gareth E. Rees is somebody I've only mentioned briefly on the channel before. And Gareth has a website called Unofficial Britain. And this is his book, Unofficial Britain, which came out in hardcover back in, let's have a look. I bought this when it came out. It just appeared one day at work, 2020. And it has been out in paperback for years now. And this is really good and very funny. And this is kind of like light psychogeography. And I don't mean light in terms of his throwaway. It's that he's not all portentous all the time and pretentious. It's really, really good. And it's all about car parks and pylons, things like that. Haunted housing estates, flyovers and underpasses. And there's quite a bit of it set in the West Country, and I really enjoyed it. And what I didn't realise till recently is that Gareth writes fiction as well. So he is in that anthology. And yeah, this is really good. He's also done a book just about car parks. And I have ordered a couple of his short story collections, which I'm going to read and review on the channel over the next few months. So if you like a bit of psychogeography, if you like that Ballardian M25 thing that he does in his last few novels, that J.G. Ballard did in his last few novels, you know, this is really good. But he's got a light touch and a light heart. It's really good, actually. So Gareth, I'm going to be looking at your stories because I've enjoyed them. Going back briefly to Out of the Darkness, there is the opening story in this is by Nicholas Royle, who is one of my obsessions. And Nicholas Royle, really good writer, same age as me. There's a video coming up on the channel soon about him, or it might have already come up by the time you do the others. Because you know what I'm like. I just come out with this stuff and post it when it feels right. And the opening story is called Nocturia. And Nocturia is what you get when you have the urge to get up in the middle of the night to go and urinate. And, you know, a lot of us guys know what that's like. And it's absolutely fantastic. And the thing with Nicholas is he writes very straightforward, but he's very quirky, but very readable. He's quirky without being a flake. Do you know what I mean? And I'll just sort of read a little bit. In Macclesfield, there's 2 of everything. There are 2 trains to London every hour and 2 trains from London if you assume that 1 in every 2 scheduled services will be late. There are 2 platforms in the station. And he riffs on this, on how there are 2s of things. And as I say, this anthology is supposed to be about mental health. And it's a fantastic story. And even though a lot of the stories in this left me cold, I'll be keeping it for the stories by Nicholas, by Gary Budden and Gareth E. Rees. Great stuff. So, going a bit further into Nicholas Royle, I did a video about Nick about 2 years ago about his book White Spines, which is about collecting picador books. And it's also about how the fact there are 2 Nicholas Royles. I'll put a link at the end of the video, which is quite confusing because you read the one and you read the other and they're quite different. But a lot of us have been fooled into thinking they're the same person. They're not. There's a Professor Nicholas Royle and there's this Nicholas Royle, the one I'm talking about, who is also has an academic career as well as a writing career. So slightly confusing. And I did have an email correspondence with this Nicholas about it. And very nice guy, actually. Big book collector. And in the last week, I've read these 2 novellas by Nicholas Royle, which I've had for a good while and not got around to. And I'm going to talk about them now. This is The Appetite. And this is from Grey Matter, small press. And there are only 100 copies of this. And this is number 17, signed by Nicholas Royle and by Michael Marshall Smith, who does the introduction. And this is a very, very funny first-person narrative. And it's about a guy who works in an office, and it's London in the late 80s. And there's a hurricane, and I seem to think it's based on a hurricane that happened then. I can't recall. I'm sure there was that big hurricane, wasn't there? Lots of trees came down and things. And this guy works in central London. He works near Russell Square, which is near the British Library. If you watch the J.G. Ballard multi-author anthology signing at Forbidden Planet, which I put up on the channel last November, you'll see me in Russell Square. And also the recent London Vintage Paperback show video, that was near Russell Square as well, just off it. And I got out of Russell Square tube station. So set up that way. So it seems very familiar. A nice part of London, Bloomsbury, actually. And this chap works in this office and he ends up meeting this woman. This woman falls on him, literally. The hurricane sweeps loads of people up into the air, and this lady just falls down on top of him, and he catches her. And they have a kind of connection. She's married, he's single, and they basically fall in love. And you see how their relationship develops. And she actually lives out of London and feels bad about the situation with her husband. And the narrator has, you get into all the people who work in his office, and they're really funny. There's one of them who is somebody everybody dislikes. There's another guy who wears sort of tartan punk trousers, who's very funny, who's always working on his old vintage cars. And it's very, very witty and direct. If you can get hold of it, do. It's a shame it's so limited, because it's really good. This is the sort of fiction which should be out there in bigger quantities, but, you know, Nick's a real cult writer. And something strange is happening in London, is that houses are sort of moving together, things are squashing together, things are becoming distorted, and that reminded me of a J. Sheridan Le Fanu story. But if you can get hold of The Appetite, do, because it's good. It's really funny, brilliant. You can't tell where it's going. I absolutely loved it. It's got a real warm heart to it, which is fantastic. Also, I read this novella by Nicholas Royal, The Enigma of Departure, and this is published by PS. And PS do lots of great stuff. And let me see. This is the hardcover, £10. It is out of print. You can get out there. There was a signed jacketed hardcover, 25. And the story of this is, if you ever watched Don't Look Now by Nick Roeg, the film with Julie Christie and Don Sutherland, a lot of this is set in Venice. And it's the first person narrative of a journalist who does some art writing. And he is invited via email to go and cover a certain exhibition at the Venice Biennale. And he thinks, well, you know, it's going to cost me more money to get there and do it than it will to be paid for the article. And he's kind of drifting along. But then he sees that one of the people exhibiting there is a woman he used to know and who he was in love with at some point. And there's little references to Don't Look Now in here. And it's a lot more ambiguous and dark and strange. But I really loved it, and he's just a great writer. He hasn't really sort of settled down into a groove. He's done 7 novels, collections of short stories. He edits a lot of things. He self-publishes chapbooks through Nightjar Press. He did a John Fox one, M. John Harrison one. He does about 4-6 a year. He's a big book collector, great guy. And I can only say really that, you know, if you can find Nicholas Royal books and pick them up, do. Now, as I say, there is another Nicholas Royal, so watch the video at the end here. And if you're in any doubt about which is which, pop something in the comments below and I'll answer, because I've worked out who's who, because you can't always trust all the online sources. So there's a few things I've been reading. So do try and pick up Gary Budden's books. I think they're amongst the best contemporary fiction I've read for ages, and they're of interest to anybody who likes weird fiction, psychogeography, punk rock, English landscapes, bird watching, all sorts of wonderful stuff. Really, really great. And also, if you want to enjoy the quirky side of Britain, Gareth E. Rees is worth looking at. And as I say, wonderful novellas from Nick Royal. So those have been some of my reading enthusiasms over the last week or so. This week, I've done very little reading. I've been doing lots of other things. But last week, those really, really blew me away. Fantastic stuff. So look into these people. There'll be a lot more stuff like this on the channel. It'll be a lot more analytic and detailed. This is really just coming from the heart to tell you how much I enjoyed these books. And wonderful, wonderful stuff. More on these writers to come, I promise. Bye for now.